Okay, the previous lecture, I was talking about how different cations are held with differing strengths. This then suggests a way that it is possible to measure the cation exchange capacity of a soil. So imagine that you have a kilogram of a soil. This soil has a certain level of cation exchange capacity. It's going to differ between different soils. Each of the sites that can bind a cation or part of a multivalent cation is occupied with something. What you want to do is you want to wash off all of those random somethings and replace them with a uniform level of something that you can then later measure. So what the typical procedure I have heard of is you take an ammonium solution. Here's ammonium right here. Doesn't matter that some things are held more tightly than it because you are putting in an excess of it. An excess will override how tightly things are held. So you put your soil in usually a funnel with a filter or something in it. You wash it with a solution of a known concentration of ammonium ion. You use an excess of that. It washes all of the other cations off, which you can collect in a beaker underneath your filter. You can just throw those out. You don't need them. Then you're going to rinse it with deionized water. That deionized water then will remove any unbound ammonium. Then what you need to do is set up so that you can measure the amount of ammonium that was there. In this case, you're going to use a potassium solution to knock off the ammonium. You're going to collect the ammonium, and then you do a titration, like any kind of a standard pH titration you would do in a chemistry class, and measure how much ammonium was actually bound on there. The amount of ammonium bound in the cation exchange capacity is going to be proportional to what the actual cation exchange capacity was. So different cations are held with different strengths by soil particles, and it is possible to knock off cations by introducing large amounts of another cation or a cation that's held more strongly. So in this case, it's going to be the large amounts. A similar process to this is when you lime a soil. Liming a soil to raise the pH, what you're doing is you are putting on an excess of calcium and forcing some of the hydrogen ion out. And over time, that will raise the pH of the soil. So when people use lawn lime or they use agricultural lime, that's what they're doing. In the lab, like I said, I basically described how you measure cation exchange capacity. And just to review that, you use a filter apparatus with your soil. You use a known quantity of soil. Again, all of this is going to be quantitatively measured. You use a known quantity of a known strength of ammonium solution. This is going to force all the other random cations that are in the soil off. Then ammonium will fill those cation sites. Now what you've got is each cation site occupied by ammonium. You want to rinse off any of the unbound excess with deionized water. Like I said, now you're ready to measure. You use a potassium solution typically, because it's easy to make up, to force that ammonium ion off, and then you titrate to find out the quantity of ammonium. And that tells you the cation exchange capacity. Now, most of the time, soils are going to have a cation exchange capacity, which indicates a negative charge on the particle. Remember, opposites attract. So if a cation is being held by the soil, then you're looking at an anionic quality or a negatively charged quality to the soil. However, there are some rare cases where a clay will have a positive charge. Sometimes you see this in soils with what is called a pH-dependent charge, and I will talk about that in more detail later on. These soils will then attract and adsorb anions or negatively charged particles. But cation exchange capacity is far more common. So, kind of moving on and looking at the different types of soil particles. All clays are secondary minerals. Remember, I said earlier in the class, a secondary mineral is one that develops when you have a process of chemical weathering that leads to a chemical change and a change in what the mineral is that's present. And there are 4 different types of colloids. There are phyllosilicate clays, which in the temperate zone are by far the most common ones. They're the most heavily studied ones, partly because they tend to have more or less of a regular structure. And scientists, we tend to like things that we can describe that aren't just, it varies. Also, these are things that are economically important. Kaolinite clay, which used to be incredibly valuable for porcelain clay things. There are areas where their whole industry was built on the fact that they had deposits of high quality kaolinite clay that could then be used in potteries, for example. So a lot of these clays have economic value. Then there are also iron and aluminum oxide clays. These tend to be highly weathered. You find these in tropical regions and to a certain extent in some of the highly, highly weathered soils of the southern US. There are also allophane and other amorphous clays. These tend to form from volcanic ash. They're a little bit geographically restricted in where you find them. Again, there's not as much known about them. And then you've got humus. Humus, of course, is not a mineral clay. It comes from an organic origin. It's highly decomposed organic material. But we group it in with these because it behaves like a clay. And my mind always blips to, because I am a Generation Xer, and I grew up watching this. The old show they used to have on Sesame Street back in the 70s about one of these things is not like the other. Well, humus is the one of these things that's not like the other because it's an organic origin thing. It has properties like clays, but it's not formed like clays. So the different clays are going to differ in their chemical structure. They're going to differ in how they formed. They're going to differ in what they formed from. So what is their parent material? They're going to differ in their physical and their chemical properties. And like I said, the best known and the most important of these tend to be the so-called phyllosilicate clays. So looking at the phyllosilicate clays, these tend to be very common in temperate region soils. The clays we have around here are by and large phyllosilicate in structure. The nice thing about these, as I said, is they have a specific crystalline structure, and I will spend more time probably in the next lecture talking about the structure of these. The structure of these is more regular or more orderly than other colloidal particles. And again, I suspect that's one of the reasons why they're highly studied. Their structure is leaf-like. This is where the term phyllo comes from in phyllosilicate clays. Phyllo or phyllos has to do with leaf-shaped. I don't know if anybody in here likes to bake or cook or likes Greek food, but phyllo dough, which is that real thin, almost papery dough that they make baklava and some other dishes out of, the phyllo in phyllo dough comes from the same root. It's phylos in its structure. So if you're familiar with like baklava or spanakopita's, think about the dough in that, and that can help you visualize the layers in a phyllosilicate clay. Typically, these are composed of layers. There are layers that are silicon-based layers, and then layers that are aluminum or magnesium-based layers. And we're going to see those in greater detail later on. Then you have the iron and aluminum oxides. As I said, these are highly weathered clays. Sometimes these are known by the term sesquioxides. These tend to be found in tropical areas. They're red or yellow in color. They're not a particularly fertile soil. They don't hold nutrients well. This is partly because they're very highly weathered. Most of the cation exchange capacity in them, based on the structure of the clay, has broken down. And so these are what are called pH-dependent cation exchange sites. pH-dependent cation exchange sites are going to vary extremely with the pH of the soil. And some of these have kind of a crystalline form. Some of these have kind of an amorphous form. I'll talk about these just a little bit more later on. And then you have allophane and amorphous clays. As I said, we don't know a whole lot about these. They're not that widely studied. They tend to form from igneous material or from volcanic ash. There's probably, I would guess, some development of these taking place on Mount St. Helens, for example, which had a massive volcanic eruption in May 1980, coming up on 40 years ago now. And there was a lot of ash that was developed and that was deposited as a result of this. These tend to be called amorphous because they don't have a defined crystalline structure to them. They're primarily composed of silicon and aluminum. So again, a lot of these clays have the basic elements in common. How they're arranged and their properties are going to differ. And allophane and amygdalite are the most common forms. And again, like the iron and aluminum oxide clays, their ability to hold nutrients, they don't have what we call isomorphous substitution. Rather, they have what's called a pH-dependent charge. And so their ability to hold nutrients is going to vary with the pH of the soil. And I already mentioned allophane is probably the most widely known, as much as it is, form of this. There are other different names for them. You could probably go out and do a search on those if you wanted to. And then finally, we have humus. Humus, as I said, this is organic in origin. This is a very highly weathered, very highly decomposed type of organic matter. You cannot tell what type of material it came from. There are sort of different grades of organic matter in soil. There's the one grade of organic matter where you pick it up and you go, oh, this used to be a leaf of a plant, or oh, this is the outermost wings of a beetle. You can kind of tell what it came from. Then there's partially decomposed organic matter where you might tell that it had vegetable origin or animal origin, but you couldn't tell what it came from exactly. And then there's humus. Humus is very highly decomposed. You know it's organic matter because of its high carbon content, but you don't know what it came from. The behavior of humus is in many ways similar to that of mineral clays. Humus doesn't have a regular crystalline form. It tends to be very large biological molecules. In fact, my understanding is some of these are so large that when you try to do something like HPLC or some kind of other procedure on it to try to figure out the structure, it actually gums up the machine, or at least I've been told that. So these are very large, long chain molecules. Many of them are organic acids in nature. And as I said, they result from highly decomposed organic matter. And again, they have a strong pH-dependent charge. So this is a good stopping place. I'm going to go ahead and end here. The next lecture, we will actually get into the structure of the phyllosilicate clays, which are, as I said, the most abundant and the best known type of these clays.